Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Rosa and Rubini podcast, Making Sense of This World. My name is Manas Chawla, and as always, I'm really pleased to be joined by CEO and Head of Research, Brunella Rosa. This week, we're stepping outside our usual ambit a little bit, and we're talking about some exciting stuff. The new space race, how it replicates old geopolitical alliances, particularly with an Indian twist. Brunella, we saw some exciting news recently last week. Russia launched a robotic probe. Could you give me some more background on this and just a bird's eye view of the recent space developments?
Yeah, so effectively, um, we are looking at this because we believe it's one of the many um, battlefields of the ongoing uh, tech war between US and China. And we have named a few: artificial intelligence, big data, cyber warfare, quantum computing, and you name it. So this is an additional battlefield, very important because there might be significant economic implications attached to it. Even if you're talking only to the direct expenditure by governments to send in these rockets and probes into the space, we're talking about a huge amount of money, a huge budget in the 60s, 70s, when NASA sent its rockets to the moon and organized the moon landing. It reached like 4% of the US GDP, which is an enormous figure. So it's important geopolitically and economically. In a nutshell, the US have uh, started to lead a new consortium, let's call it that way, uh, behind the so-called Artemis Accords, which comprises several countries, around 27, from Europe to Asia, to other parts of the world, and the Middle East and so on. We can discuss. And on the other side, there's of course China, which has its own space development program. And Russia initially was had signed an agreement with the US. And then, not surprisingly, considering anything else that has the last few years has moved to the Chinese side. And last week, Russia sent its Luna 25 probe by using a Soyuz rocket. It was kind of a surprising move. I mean, in the middle of the Ukrainian war, everybody's thinking about these rockets as something military evolved, and so people thought, "Oh my goodness, is it a new weapon, or is going to be a new satellite to spy, God knows what." The reality is part of a program that is ongoing from both sides. The Artemis launches first objects in orbit at the end of 2022, and China has its own ongoing um, uh, missions, and the US and these Artemis projects have, of course, started their own.
Absolutely. And there's two sort of different contenders perhaps now than there were in the initial Cold War. And now as the US and China are both getting involved in this, they definitely have sort of different approaches to space, but possibly also different goals. Could you elaborate on both of those points?
Yeah, sure. So the goal is effectively the same by both contenders. They want to uh, arrive to the side of to a side of the moon on which they can establish some form of monopoly. This is not different from, you call it if you want, the conquering of the west side of the US by the pioneers, kind of a couple of centuries ago. When people were going there, it was a kind of a virgin land. Nobody claim anything on it. So you go there, you put your kind of a hole in the ground and say, "That's mine." And it's effectively what they want to do on the moon. Who can claim anything on the moon? But if you arrive there, you start establishing a presence, and then you say, "Well, that's mine." And then somebody else will go in another side that will say, "Well, that's mine." And then, of course, the aim is getting the potential minerals that are there and that can be extremely useful, especially to find what are called rare earths, which on the moon would sound a bit peculiar. Let's call it rare materials to build, for example, semiconductors or green energy vehicles, stuff like that. The approach is going to be, of course, different. The US is having a multilateral approach with the involvement of the private sector, and we know that Amazon founder Jeff Bezos has his own rocket that is being developed by the company that is dedicated to that called Blue Origin, and the rocket is called Blue Moon. And of course, we know that Elon Musk has his own Starship rocket deriving from SpaceX company. So two different approaches, but with kind of the same aim.
Let's also talk a bit about just in terms of alliances more globally. How similar is this to what it was like in the Cold War, and are there any kind of players that are picking, both sides, so to say, on an independent path?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, like the first moon race of the 60s, 70s of last century, is happening because the Cold War is happening between the two superpowers. At the time, of course, it was the US and the Soviet Union. This time around, it is US and China. The alliances for this race are very similar to the one that we have been seeing for the last few years on the geopolitical sphere. And in particular, as I said before, Russia moving from the US when Roscosmos signed an agreement to develop effectively an orbiting space station called Lunar Gateway with NASA. They moved out of that deal signed in 2017 to sign a new deal in 2021 with China for an agreement to build the International Lunar Research Station. It's effectively kind of an embryonic form of a colony on the moon. So Russia moved from the US to China, and here is in front of our eyes the traditional alliances coming. The US with several European countries, France, Italy, the UK, Canada, Japan. So traditional, let's call it Western alliances, and China redeveloping its alliances of some key emerging markets, including Pakistan, Bangladesh, Iran, very important, we know how developed they are, Mongolia, Peru, Thailand, and other countries of the Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. Coming to the second part of your question, that's, I think, very interesting because we singled out three countries that, in our opinion, are in an interesting position. First of all, is Turkey, that in fact, in this race, is siding with China and Russia effectively. And we know that Turkey wants to be a bit in the middle between the US and China. It wants to show to be a friend of Russia, potentially broker for a deal peace between Russia and Ukraine. So we know that Turkey wants to create his own sphere of influence. In this case, is with China and Russia. We don't think that Turkey, being a NATO member, can hold this position for much longer, considering the type of technologies that you have developed, the kind of secrets that you have to hold. Is going to be extremely hard for Turkey to remain in position. It's the United Arab Emirates, which managed to sign both the Artemis Accords and also agreements with China. Again, I think both the US and China will tell the UAE to make a decision effectively in the same logic of Cold War II, either with me or against me. I mean, you can't stay on both sides. But most interestingly, and that's why we reported in the title, is the position of India. So now India, we have said for several times, is the only country that can afford for the time being to be in the middle between, say, US and China in World War II, because they have the size, the population, type of growth, the technology, and so on, not to be forced into one or the other camp just yet. But in this case, they did decide to side with the US. They signed the Artemis Accord, and they are an important component of the various technologies that need to be built and sent to the space. And that's clearly very important because, as I said before, the type of technology they develop, the kind of secrets, lots of this stuff is military in nature, even if the mission itself is civilian, but it's military in nature because you have to use lots of military kind of facilities. The fact that India has decided to stay with the US may be a signal that in the broader Cold War II, they might eventually, instead of being non-aligned, decide to side with the US rather than Russia and China. And that might be confirmed by the recent meetings. We discussed them in a previous podcast between Modi and Biden in Washington, where lots of agreements were signed on technology, on defense, on drones and rockets. So it might be a sign that India, that is holding this sort of non-aligned position at the moment, eventually would side with the US rather than Russia and China. Time will tell. This is going to be a long race. It's going to be interesting, definitely very, very important to watch for the reasons I said before, both geopolitical and economic.
I see. It's very interesting because whenever we look at new spheres of geopolitical competition, we try to project sort of, existing global orders onto them. But in this case, the geopolitics of space might well be a precursor to the geopolitics of on Earth, effectively, particularly with India's position. So definitely something we're going to continue to watch. And as always, Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you very much. Until next time.